Today we're going to cover background information for Persepolis, and these are the slides on it. Since we're virtual right now, you do not have to take notes, but the underlined information is the important part, so I would always recommend writing down the title and then using bullet points, and really all you need is the underlined material. But you can always add more. So Alexander the Great does play a part in this book in kind of the mythology established with it. He conquered Persepolis, which is not the capital of Iran, but we'll get to that later. He was charismatic. That seems to be something that famous rulers have, is charisma, which means when they speak, they inspire people and they get followers. So even if you don't agree with everything they say, they just move you to want to follow them. But he was also ruthless, which is violent, and brilliant, power-hungry, bloodthirsty. And he inspired the historical epoch called the Hellenistic period. He's really old, so he's from Macedonia in 356 BC. That's like almost 2,500 years ago. That's a long time ago. And of course, like any great leader, legend has it that his father was Zeus. But really, his parents were King Philip II and Queen Olympias. He became king at the age of 20, which is pretty young. I don't think I'm ready to be king or queen or president, and I'm like quite a bit older than he is. So anyhow, that's a little bit on Alexander the Great. Iran. As you guys will find in the introduction, Marjane Satrapi writes that she doesn't want Iran to be seen as a country only known for its wrongdoings, which is basically all the violence that has been going on in Iran since like the late 1970s through today. So hopefully when you read this book, you don't focus on the bad, but you can see parts of the culture that are rich. So today their population is 70 million. They are primarily Persian with other minor groups as well. They are also primarily Muslim for their religious background, and there's two types. There's Shia Muslim, which is the majority, and Sunni Muslim. 1% is Jewish, Baha'i, and Zoroastrian. So it's mostly a Muslim country, and there's conflict between the two types of Muslims as well. Iran doesn't have one language, and fun fact, neither does the United States. English is not the national language. There is no national language of the United States, which is pretty interesting. And I don't even know if there's legislation going on right now. You could ask your history teachers and get back to me. Arizona, I believe, has a state language of English, but I'm not sure about that. So anyhow, in Iran, there's multiple languages. In Spain, there's multiple national languages, and it's not just Spanish. So that's pretty cool. Well, I think it's cool. You guys probably don't. But anyhow, Farsi and Persian dialects are the majority, but then there's others. So Tehran is the capital, just so you guys know. And so that way you can kind of see it's near Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and then here's Europe. Oh, there's Iraq. This is in a different language, so the spelling's a little different. Azerbaijan is right there, Armenia, so you can kind of see. This is actually a picture of the ruins of Persepolis, which is, I think, pretty cool, pretty beautiful. It was the seat of the government, so like the capital, under Cyrus the Great, which was about 2,500 years ago. And the center of the Achaemenid Empire. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Probably not. And it was only an empire for 200 years or less, which isn't that long. I mean, the United States has only been around about that length of time. So Alexander the Great captured Persepolis in 330 BC and destroyed several palace buildings. And he really damaged the palace of Xerxes. So you want to think about leaders in this book and what does it mean to be a leader? What do they do? And sometimes an effective leader isn't a good leader, which we'll also cover when we read Night and Lord of the Flies. Modern Iran. It seems like oil is cause for trouble pretty much anywhere, and after the advent of automobiles and all the uses for oil and gasoline. European imperialists wanted to control Iran for its oil, right? And so what did they do? They asked the US for help, and everyone overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 to restore a brutal and oppressive Shah to power. And they were worried about the Soviet Union's influence. This was right around the time of the Red Scare, where there was a fear of communists in the United States. And of course, the Soviet Union was kind of like the mother country. But anyhow, overthrowing Mossadegh prompted or paved the way for the 1979 revolution and the Islamic Republic. In 1935, the country changed its name from Persia to Iran, and then public education progressed rapidly with new social classes. So there was a professional middle class and an industrial working class. I think a lot of people assume that women in the Middle East wearing veils and not having as many rights as men, that was always the case. But actually, in the early 1900s, so in the 20th century, and less than 100 years ago, they were more similar to the West and Europe and the United States. And then came the Islamic Revolution. So this is kind of confusing because you guys have a lot of history to cover in world history. You can hardly cover all of American history in one full year. So how do teachers expect you to be able to cover world history for all the countries from the beginning of time to today? It's impossible. So I doubt most of you guys know information about Iran. But it's really important that you do, because there's still controversy going over there. There's still complex political systems happening, and they'll play out in this book, but it's also really important that we're aware of different forms of society in our world and what's going on. So what happened with the Islamic Revolution? Mohammad Reza Shah was sick, so he left Iran for 18 months in 1979. His prime minister, Shapur Bakhtiar, couldn't keep order, and he allowed the Ayatollah Khomeini to return. Khomeini took control of the government by using fear and violence, and you're going to see that in Persepolis. And then Iran was plagued by ethnic unrest as minorities demanded some kind of autonomy. So they wanted to be respected, they wanted their own. Revolutionary court sentenced some of these minority leaders to death, so the majority didn't want these minority groups to have any power or voice. They wanted a more racially monotone, that's not the right word, country, rather than the richness that multiple cultures bring to a country. They banned leftist newspapers, opposition leaders were arrested, and Khomeini was interestingly against the United States. Education was seen as the way to get high status jobs and then political power. So when you guys think about education and your futures, from what I've read from a lot of you guys, is after high school, you want to go to college. You want a job that pays well. You want a high status job. Not necessarily political power. I think very few of you are interested in that. But a lot of you say, like, oh, you're going to use education as the way to do that. So take that seriously, and I hope that you start becoming more diligent in your classes, because you know that education plays a really important role in what you can do in life. The middle class resented the elite for blocking their opportunities, so there's always a class struggle, because each class wants more. So it's just kind of interesting that the upper class will try to prevent other people from joining the upper class, at least in Iran. So these are some terms I wanted to cover that you guys will understand. Culture. This is a hard term. We call it a baggy monster in the literary world or in like the academic literary world, because it's hard to really define well. It's not a very specific term. In a nutshell, it's the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement. So culture is what you eat, when you eat, how you eat it. It is the music you listen to. It's the language you speak. It's um, roughly the hours you keep. It's what your society values. It's your religion. It's how you dress. It's so many different things. And even like you can even analyze the culture of a family. So even though all of us live in Flagstaff, I'm sure all of our family lives are very different. So culture can be a microcosm or a mini world, as small as your family to as big as your country. So rather than use the term culture, even though I use that in this presentation, um, I would try to be more specific in your writing. Then there's the Eastern versus the Western world. It's a perceived dichotomy, meaning people see it as different, but they're not that different. There are different environments, and where you live shapes how you behave. For instance, in Flagstaff, well, at least for me, I don't go out that much in winter because it's cold and snowing, and I don't have that much experience driving in the snow. I prefer to stay home and knit. In the summer in Flagstaff, I go out all the time. But in Tucson, when I lived there, like no one went out in the summer. You knew exactly how to strap your seatbelt on so you didn't touch metal, because if you touched metal, oh my goodness, so painful. So environment shapes how you act. Education. It's people say that Eastern people live in time, um, and they don't like schedule changes, whereas Western people live in space. They follow their dreams and do what they want. The stereotype is that the East is passive and submissive and they think a lot, whereas Western people do more and think less. And that actually is true in terms of politics. Even between the United States and Europe, it takes Europe so long to get things done, whereas the United States just acts. Stereotypes, widely held, fixed, and oversimplified ideas. Which I already have talked about. The Eastern versus Western world, perceived dichotomy, those are all stereotypes. And they're oversimplified. All of these systems are so complicated. Greco-Roman, it basically means relating to ancient Greek and Romans. Not too hard. Okay, the Persian Empire was from the 6th century BC. And then the Achaemenid Empire to the 20th century AD in the Kahar dynasty. So that's one of the oldest civilizations, and the ancestry is really long. They valued scholars and education, and I think you'll see the value of scholarship and education in Persepolis as well. That's going to be a big idea. So Islam, Muslim, Quran. Islam is the religion of the Muslims. It's a monotheistic faith descended from Muhammad. It's one of the 3 major monotheistic religions in the world. Monotheistic means believing in one God, so it is. And they all trace their way back to Abraham. So it is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all 3. And they all connect with Abraham. The Quran is their sacred book, believed to be the word of God as dictated by Muhammad, to Muhammad by the Archangel Gabriel in Arabic. And Islam is the youngest of the 3 monotheistic religions. Judaism is the oldest. It was traditionally separated the sexes were traditionally separated, and women wore a veil outside of their home. Their idea of an ideal society was where women were confined to the home. And I think that belief system is still playing out today. Also, Sharia law. That is a term that I think was misunderstood for a long time, specifically in the early 2010s. Basically, they're just Islamic laws, but they do have fatwas against those who break the law, which are kind of like they try to get the people who break the laws. There's laws for everything: rituals, politics, marriage, everything that you can think of. And a harem refers to anything forbidden by Allah. Fundamentalists, which exist in all 3 monotheistic religions and in other religions as well, are people who uphold religious belief in strict literal interpretation of the scripture. And it's particularly strong in Islam and Protestant Christianity right now. Radical means a change relating to the fundamental nature of something. So it's very different from the normal. Marginalization means the treatment of a group of people as insignificant or peripheral. So if you're in the minority, you've probably been marginalized in your life because that's just how society tends to work, unfortunately. But you guys are the future, and you can change that if you want. Tyranny is an oppressive government or rule. Secular means that there's no religion, and a martyr is killed for their beliefs, usually religious, sometimes political. Yeah, I'd say religious and political are the main ones. Subversive is seeking or intending to disrupt an established system or institution. So, like senior prank day is subversive to the high school. And it's just trying to disrupt or change something. Exile means that you are barred from your native country, usually for political reasons. Exile was seen as so bad in the ancient world that Socrates, he was probably, well, one of the earliest philosophers that I know of. And he was in Greece, and he asked a lot of questions. That's how he got people to start thinking, is he didn't tell people what he thought. He would just ask them questions, and through those questions they would realize, like, oh, something's wrong, or maybe I disagree with something. And of course the leaders didn't like that because it's subversive. And so he was either sentenced to death or exile. He had to choose. And he chose death over exile because that was so bad. I don't think many people would act like that these days. It's just something to think about. Proletariat is working class people used in reference to Marx. And if we were reading Animal Farm this year, there's also Marxist ideas in Animal Farm. And so that's why we're covering this vocabulary. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with any of it. You should know important Marxist terms. Bourgeoisie, try spelling that word. I don't think I can spell it, even though I've taught this book a while now. And yeah, it's a hard word. It's another Marxist term, and it's the capitalist class who owns most of the wealth and means of production. So they're the ones in charge. Belligerent means hostile. Revolutionary, someone who goes against the government and wants to have a different government. Illiterate means unable to read or write. And then the class system in Iran is a little bit more complex than in the United States. They have the upper classes, and you can see who controls them. After the revolution, they didn't have political influence. And after the revolution, it was religious expertise and faithfulness. That was the main criteria for becoming the political elite. The middle class were the professionals, and they had a Western education that was secular. And it sounds like that's the education that Marjane started to have. Working class, factory workers, and about 25% of the population, and the lower class were mostly illiterate, manual labor, marginal existence. And servants were in this group. So, get an education. I know a lot of you guys always say that you hate reading, but being able to read and literacy really is a privilege that even today isn't guaranteed in all of the world. So that is the background information for Persepolis.